And now I'd like to introduce Dimity Hawkins, who many of you will know as the co-founder of IPAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, receiver of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. She's currently a PhD candidate at Swinburne University of Technology. Is Dimity there?
Hello there. Hi, everybody.
Over to you, Dimity.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry not to be able to join you in the room there in Canberra today, and especially sorry after hearing that wonderful talk from Tim, because I would love to have so many more conversations with him right now. But it's been wonderful to tune in online today with so many speakers. So thank you, IPAN, for making this conference possible and for the invitation to speak. I join you this afternoon from Naarm in Melbourne, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I acknowledge the elders of this beautiful place and that the lands here and throughout what is known as Australia were never ceded. This is a central acknowledgement, as others have said, as the war on First Nations people continues in this country. As a person from an old settler colonial background, I am mindful of how much we need to ground our work for peace back home before anything else. I was honoured to be asked to speak here today. All of you no doubt have much to share on this topic, how to win collaborative activism for peace and climate action. There's a lot of very smart people in the room, I know, and I would love to be having conversations with all of you. But I just want to touch on two things today. Firstly, the key example of collaboration that has seen the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons come into force through the work of global networks like ICAN and the broader peace movement alongside certain governments. And secondly, the work that we face from here. But before that, I also wanted to mention that the IPAN report is a fantastic example of collaborative collectivism. Its scope, which goes across First Nations, environment, security, unions, social justice, foreign policy, and more, is indicative of the breadth of challenges identified by the peace movement. So I want to congratulate all the authors and the coordinators and contributors to this remarkable new resource. I really hope it'll be received well and it will gain much interest in politics at the moment. ICAN Australia welcomes the new report. We particularly welcome, of course, the calls in the report for the Australian government to explicitly reject all use of nuclear weapons in pursuing Australia's national security and to sign and ratify the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, because it is well past time that they did. 9 countries right now hold over 12,700 nuclear weapons in the world. Many of these are on hair trigger alert. I don't have to tell you the number and gravity of threats that have been made in recent times around these weapons. Juxtaposed to this, we have the TPNW and a global movement that is uplifting and working towards the goal of the elimination of nuclear weapons. The treaty itself is groundbreaking for many of the reasons that Tim just outlined, because it was informed by civil society, by survivors, by experts outside of governments as well as governments. It comprehensively bans not only nuclear weapons, but also the threat of the use of them, the testing, the sharing, and the hosting of them. Under this treaty, the only thing you can do with nuclear weapons is get rid of them. The treaty also acknowledges the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. The treaty stipulates support for victims or survivors of nuclear weapons use and testing. It seeks to address environmental remediation. It aims to build positive obligations for those people and places most affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. These commitments must be led by those who have the lived experience expertise, assisted by those with other political, humanitarian, scientific, and medical knowledges. So, while national polls show that 72 to 78% of Australians support the TPNW, we are yet to see the Australian government join the treaty. But importantly, we have a strong commitment built into the Labor Party's national policy platform since 2018, hard fought for and won, for this government to sign and ratify the TPNW. A promise made must be kept. We have seen far too many broken promises, and far too many half measures in the past, so we have a lot of work still to do here. When we began our campaign, it was in an era of diplomatic disappointment, frustration, and war, not dissimilar to today in some ways. It was in the years following the September 11 attacks as the war on terror raged and Bush radicalized talk of either being with us or against us. At this time, we also saw something of a collapse of diplomacy, and the work for nuclear disarmament was largely marginalized and sidelined, to say the least. But never entirely, because there has never been a time in modern human history that there have not been voices speaking for peace. We began ICAN with a grassroots collaboration across nations, pushed from us here in Australia, building expectations that we needed to talk of disarmament, despite the pervasive atmosphere of war. We recognized that to address the multifaceted challenge of nuclear weapons, we needed to work to stigmatize, ban, and eliminate these weapons. In the founding of ICAN, we recognized that it is the human story, as Mary was saying before, that cuts through all else. That lived experience is essential when seeking to address disarmament and remediation. Remembering and truth-telling about the past helps break silences imposed on us and prevents future harm. To locate these stories takes true collaboration, the respectful, careful, skilled, and honest collaborations that build trust between impacted communities and activists, technical experts, governments, and more. From our launch here in Naarm in 2007 to the day that we saw the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons voted in at the United Nations in 2017, it was a dizzying decade of global collaboration across 100 countries and hundreds of partner organizations. Here in Australia, that has included 88 partner organizations, including IPAN. It's been another 5 years of work seeing the treaty enter into force and hold its first meeting of states parties, which it did in July of this year. The states parties to the TPNW and other signatory and observer states came together in Vienna for that first meeting. The new Albanese government sent a representative to the meeting, a welcome change in engagement after a decade of utter obstruction previously. The government has since made some other small steps in the right direction, but as others have called for here today, we welcome all efforts to urge this government to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We expect to see a far more vigorous engagement with the action plan that arose from the states parties in July. And we know that this will happen because of civil society's engagement in that process. You've heard so much today from many speakers and no doubt in conversation in the room together about the challenges we face. But I want to go back to something that Richard Tant has said this morning. In the face of increasing polarized military alliances in the global stage, we need to find our own forms of alliances for peace. The collaborations for war are far too dominant in today's world. As dysfunctional, divisive, and dangerous as they are, we see these alliances at play all around us. In response to the war in Europe, to the ideological brinkmanship at play between the US and China, the instability in many of the nuclear armed states, the failure of the nuclear umbrella states to relinquish the falsehood of extended nuclear deterrence. We have seen new threats of nuclear testing and nuclear dumping, and the ever-present threat of outright nuclear war. We see it in Australia's shameless acquiescence towards interoperability for our military with the US and with AUKUS. While all these factors weigh heavily on our collective sense of security, we also know the value and the possibility of what it means to collaborate for peace. We can build alliances for peace, but they must be bigger than simply opposition to war. Peace is much more than the absence of war, as we all know. Alongside the questions of avoiding war in our region, as Tim has outlined so beautifully before, we need to address issues of racism, treaty for First Nations people, nuclear colonialism, gender and sexual violence, violence against our LGBTIQ community, and climate threats so intricately linked to militarism. There are some wonderful papers on climate and militarism and nuclear weapons that have been written by ICAN's Tillman Ruff and the recent paper that's just been released by MAPW on defence emissions, which I would recommend to people. I'll put some in the link online. But my basic message here is that to build alliances for peace, we have to fearlessly acknowledge the breadth of the challenges we face. While we each have areas of particular interest, specialization, or specific aims, and certainly IPAN has had these over the past 15 years, our alliances for peace must create room to listen, learn, and grow through understanding the intersectionality in this work. The power of civil society movements is the ability to be free to explore issues without the limitations of pragmatism that we find in politics, particularly politics beholden to state capture. Here in Australia, many of us have the opportunity to bring together science, medicine, the lived experience, as well as moral and cultural issues to understand both the problems, but also the solutions. It's a powerful thing. And as such, civil society is an essential element of a functioning democracy. We have that here in Australia, despite its fragility, the many challenges and the systemic racism, ageism and misogyny that ensures that it is not always an even playing field. But we have more privileges than many in the world right now. And we therefore have a big responsibility to speak up, act up, and show up for and with one another. And this is how we win. Thank you.